Well, you very kindly listened to me for a bit, and I just think we should hear from God. So I'm going to read that story from Luke chapter 15. I'll read it from the Greek, but I'll put it in English, don't worry. Luke chapter 15, verse 11. He said, "A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the inheritance that's coming to me.' And so he divided his livelihood between them. Not many days later, gathering everything together, the younger son went away into a far country, and there he wasted his possessions, living riotously. And when he had spent everything, there came a severe famine on that land, and he began to be in need. So he went and stuck himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to be filled with the husks that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. Coming to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants abound in bread, and here I am perishing by hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' And he stood up and he went to his father. While he was still a long way away, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. And he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' And his father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf. Kill it, and let's eat and celebrate. For this, my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now, his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard the music and dancing. And he called one of the lads and asked him what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he's received him back safe and sound.' And he was angry and refused to go in. But his father went out and besought him. And he replied to his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I never transgressed your command, but you never gave me a young goat so that I could eat with and celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who devoured your property with prostitutes, came, you killed for him the fatted calf.' He said to him, 'Child, you're always with me, and all my things are your things. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this, your brother, was dead and is alive again. He is lost and is found.'" And it's amazing when you just look at that story, so many details. Have you noticed the deadpan way that the servant answers? When the brother comes in from the field, asks him what's gone on, and he says, "Your father's killed the fatted calf because he's received him back safe and sound." It's just completely factual. That's not the way the father describes it. He was dead and is alive again. So there's a huge emotional intelligence in the way this story is told. And of course, the deadpan reaction then shows up even more the emotional reaction of the brother. Notice how this older brother says, "This, your son." He's denying brotherhood just with that phrase. And then how does the father reply? He says, "This, your brother, was dead and alive again." So you get that phrase that comes up twice. The end of the bit about the younger son is, "This, my son, was dead and alive again. He was lost and is found." The end of the whole thing is, "This, your brother, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And you see so many of these sorts of little details that are there. Or where the older brother says to the father, "You killed for him the fatted calf." Actually, it's for everyone. Everyone enjoys that. So again, reinforcing a point from earlier, every single word in this story counts. Now, it's very clear that when you've got a genius story like this, it's not made by committee. It all has to come from one person, and I'm going to argue in this talk. It has to come from Jesus. And it has to be from Jesus in the very setting that Luke says it's in. Because Jesus fills it with lots of references that only scribes would get. So there's no point having a story unless you've actually got the same audience that the gospel says you've got, namely people who know the Bible very well. We've already looked how you've got a story that works if you don't know anything. It just works. But it's also got this extra level for the scribes, talking about the Jacob and Esau story. And the high point of the story is the high point of their training when they know to put dots on a particular word. But there's more to it than that. It's not just the story of Jacob and Esau. It's also the story of Jacob and Laban. There are lots of phrases in Jesus' story that come from that. The brother heard music and dancing. Well, Laban catches up with Jacob when Jacob's run away and said, I would have loved to have sent you off with mirth and songs, tambourines and lyres. But you notice how the older brother was angry and refused to go in. But in the Jacob and Laban story, it's Jacob who's angry. But the most striking one of these is this. The older brother says, all these years I've been slaving for you. That's basically what Jacob said to Laban. I had to work 7 years for daughter number 1, 7 years for daughter number 2. Actually, yes, it was that order, isn't it? Number 1 in Laban's mind was different from number 1 in Jacob's mind, but you know what I mean. And another 6 years, I've had to work for you a long time. Or the older brother says, when this son of yours came who has devoured, literally eaten your property with prostitutes. And Rachel and Leah have said, but their father has devoured their property. Or the father says at the end of the parable, all that's mine is yours. And Laban has said to Jacob, everything you see is mine, but it's not, it's Jacob's. But there's more to it. It's the story of Joseph, of course. Because when in the story, the father says, quick, get the ring and get the robes, there's only one other person who gets suddenly rings and robes in the Bible, and that's Joseph. And Joseph, when he comes out of prison from before Pharaoh, of course, that's at a time of great famine. Now, the difference between a famine and a great famine is probably a great famine is a multi-year famine, whereas just a famine is a 1 year famine. And that's a particular phrase from the Bible. It's the only other instant and lasting rags to riches story in the Bible. Yes, you get sometimes like Mordecai gets, quick exaltation, but that's not long lasting. To actually go from prison to being in charge of things, that is what you get with Joseph. Of course, Daniel is exalted, but again, it's not from prison. The rags to riches stories, these are the only two. So you get the ring and the robe. Jesus has put in the Jacob and Esau story, Laban stuff, and Joseph. And of course, more striking than that, you've got all sorts of little details. Like, for instance, the fact that no one gives any food to the prodigal, but Joseph is the guy who feeds absolutely everyone. But most striking, Joseph goes into a far country and his father thought he was dead. He's the only other son that the father thought was dead and then is alive again. So Jesus manages to build in another story from Genesis. And of course, there's a moral and there's a lesson in the Joseph story. Joseph had been really badly treated by his brothers and he forgives them. Laban had to accept that God had decreed that Jacob was going to be blessed, even if that meant blessed with Laban's property. He had to accept that. But there's even more. In the middle of the Joseph story, or near the beginning, you've got this bit, do you remember, Genesis chapter 38, I'm sure you haven't forgotten, where you've got the story of Judah and Tamar. And you remember, this is one of those many men behaving badly stories in the Bible. And it's the story of how Judah gets together with Tamar, not knowing she's his daughter-in-law, thinking she's a prostitute. Now, when the older brother gets angry, he says, you never gave me a young goat so I might celebrate with my friends, but this son of yours devoured your property with prostitutes. Now, you're a scribe. You know the phrases in the Bible. You know there's only one place in the entire Bible where you get friend, goat, and prostitute together. There's only one. And in fact, even to get two of those three together, you're really just driven to this passage, and guess what? They occur within 2 verses of each other. Really close. Because after he's done what he shouldn't have done with his daughter-in-law, he sends a friend off with payment of goats. So what's happening there? In the story of Joseph, the younger brother, is off in a far country sexually behaving, resisting Mrs. Potiphar, while Judah, the person from whom the Jews derive their name, the person to whom these scribes and Pharisees think of their ancestor, was not behaving right in the land. So it's a very, very powerful thing. But there's more. It's the story of Abraham, isn't it? A man had 2 sons. When you think of that, who can not think of Abraham? Because, of course, he is the great archetypal father figure, and father is mentioned so many times in this passage as well as in the next passage. And he begins his speech with quick. Remember that? When the guests come, Genesis 18 verse 6, he says, quick, 3 seahs of flour. And that's the very first word out of the father's mouth here, isn't it? And it all leads to Abraham ran and took a calf. Oh, so we've got quick and running. Oh, tell me, this is the first running in the Bible. So if you're a scribe, you notice the first time you copy out the word run. It's the first hospitality in the Bible, Genesis 18. The first person to say quick for anything, and it leads to a fatted calf. And it's the only other old guy in the Bible to run. Now, don't you think the scribes have noticed he's 99? That's pretty good. You're running at 99. That's pretty amazing. And so, don't you think everyone noticed? When you see this old man of Jesus' story running, who can not think of Abraham? Who then begins a speech with quick that leads to the fatted calf. And we know Jesus thought about the verse that said 3 seahs because it's his shortest story. So, it's amazing how that all fits together. But he didn't divide his inheritance between the 2 sons equally, did he? In the Abraham story, the younger son Isaac gets everything. Why? Well, Abraham's the only other father who gives away his inheritance while he's still alive. Isn't it odd to give away your inheritance while you're still alive? But that's what Abraham did. Look, Genesis 25 verses 5 and 6. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still away, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So, if you're a scribe and you know the Bible, there's quite a bit to echo the life of Abraham. But there's a little bit more. Why does Ishmael not inherit? Well, because he refuses to join the celebration for his younger brother. Look at this, Genesis 21. And the child Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. So Ishmael lost his inheritance through despising the feast for the younger son. Don't you see the warning to scribes and Pharisees? They think they're the heirs, and they think the tax collectors and sinners can't come into the kingdom of God. You despise them, it's you lot that are out. You scribes and Pharisees that think you're in, it's your place, you're out. Wow. But think of the contrast. Abraham, the father who would not allow his son to go into a far country. See that you don't take my son back there, and so on. But it's more. Northern Abraham, of course, it's the story of Cain and Abel. All of Genesis' greatest hits in one. The Bible's first brothers, the first family conflict. The older brother associated with a field and the younger brother with the care of animals, and the older brother getting angry when Abel was accepted by God. The Bible's first recorded anger is not just any old anger, it's anger specifically against a younger brother through envy. And in that story, Genesis 4, God, the father figure, graciously engages with the angry older brother. So you see, Jesus has told this 388-word story, which is 2.5 minutes long when you say it, and which has covered all of Genesis' greatest hits, right? Like, it's picked up all of those family stories, and they all make massive numbers of points. Now, not all of the connections I've shown are equally clear, but there are some pretty clear connections. Joseph, the ring and the robes, Esau running, embracing, kissing, Jacob, all these years I've worked for you, Abraham saying quick and getting the fatted calf. There are enough that you know this is really going on, and it's pretty impressive to be able to tell a story that will work if no one has any Bible background whatsoever. Meanwhile, you're stretching the scribes. But did the scribes see it all? Maybe not. Because it's not about whether they saw it, it's about whether they should have seen it. They might have listened to Jesus' story and thought, well, that's not much of a story. But come the day of judgment, they'll know. A genius was in front of them. Did they have ears to hear? What's the last phrase in the chapter just before? Let the one who has ears to hear, hear. And the thing about the way Jesus teaches is he teaches so it doesn't advantage those with more intellectual firepower. It's about the heart to receive. That's what it is. The one who has ears to hear, let him hear. There are lots of references throughout Genesis, and for me it's just simply amazing. Now, some of the references, there are people with more reason for anger. Esau lost out his entire inheritance. Laban lost his property. Joseph, whose brothers sold him. Ishmael lost inheritance through despising the younger brother. So many moral lessons that you can draw. So it's not Jesus just putting references in for the sake of it. But actually there are lessons, spiritual lessons to draw from this. Joseph forgave. Esau forgave. Laban needed to make a peace treaty, God said, and Ishmael lost his inheritance through despising his younger brother. And Abraham was welcoming of complete strangers. Really, really welcoming. So many more lessons. Now, okay, I've shown that with Jesus' longest story, but can we show the same thing going on with some of Jesus' other stories? Well, we're going to just take one in more detail, but we'll do a few briefly. So we're going to look at the story of the temporarily rich man and Lazarus. Now, I say the temporarily rich man and Lazarus. People normally say the rich man and Lazarus. One of the brilliant things Jesus does is not call him the rich man after he's got to Hades. You know, because once he's in Hades, he's not rich anymore. I mean, he sort of thinks he is. I mean, in the story, it's interesting. You know, he sees Abraham afar off. This is Luke 16, 19 through to 31. He sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. Now, he's actually come across Lazarus before because he was like at his gate the whole time. Who's he talk to? He talks to Abraham, the guy he's never met before. Why? Because Abraham's a rich man. He's a rich man. We should have a conversation together. Rich men do that. Ignore the other guy. Oh, make sure you send Lazarus like as a servant to dip the tip of his finger and bring me some water. So it's a brilliant story, and it's the story of the temporarily rich man and Lazarus. Now, how does Jesus tell the story? He tells it, again, with the same economy of words. He tells you that at the rich man's gate was laid a poor man. That's just one word in Greek, was laid. Now that's brilliant, because he's just told you Lazarus has a mobility disability without telling you that Lazarus has a mobility disability. He didn't have to be explicit, just one word, was laid. Wow. And then he tells you that the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man died also and was buried. Notice two things. One, poor man dies first. Poor people usually do die earlier. Again, it's just in Jesus' story, just like it's there. Poor man died. Was he buried? Doesn't say. It tells you the rich man's died. And you're left wondering. Now, some people say he was buried. Some people say he wasn't buried. What's the answer? The answer is we don't know, because Jesus has the brilliance enough not to need to fill in all the bits. It's okay to leave loose ends in a story. This is a loose end. I'm wondering, was he like buried, but it wasn't a big deal? Or was he not buried at all? But the poor man gets VIP treatment and is carried by the angel limousines up to Abraham's side, and the rich man is buried, and no doubt lots of people went to his funeral. And so Jesus tells this story, and it is so powerful. Then we see the rich man is in Hades, and again he's calling out to Abraham, and he sees Abraham and says, look, send Lazarus to me to dip his finger. on my tongue because my tongue is burning. And earlier in the story, we've been told that the dogs have been licking the sores of the poor man with their tongues. And so the tongue you're reminded of there, that just as the poor man burnt before, now the rich man's tongue is burning. And as Abraham says, no can do. There's a chasm. That's just not possible. Okay, send Lazarus to my 5 brothers. I've got 5 brothers, so he can warn them. Now that's really amazing because we see this rich man wasn't totally self-absorbed. You think he's a totally absorbed, self-absorbed rich man? No, he's not. He's not. He actually cares for his brothers. That's really interesting. I've got 5 brothers. Now, if you're a scribe, what does the number 5 remind you of? Oh yeah, those 5 particular books you copy out the most, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, according to the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's what Abraham refers back to. They've got Moses and also the prophets. According to those first 5 books, how many children does Lazarus have? Well, he's going to have, Abraham have. Abraham's going to have as many as the stars and the sand. 3 times in this story, this man calls out, Father Abraham, Father Abraham, Father Abraham. Dude, you've made a mathematical mistake. If Abraham is your father, you have more than 5 brothers. You see? That's what the 5 books of the law tell you. You can't claim Abraham as your father and deny that Lazarus is your brother. That's what he wanted to do. And so it's a really powerful way that this story is told. But there are other ways in which this story echoes the Old Testament. So we're told that the rich man was clothed in purple and linen and feasted sumptuously every day. Where is the only place in the Bible that we get purple and linen and feasting? Okay, that would be King Ahasuerus or Xerxes at the beginning of the book of Esther having a 180-day feast to which he didn't just invite his friends. He actually invited all of the men. I know it's men, women are having different feast. In the citadel, he invited everyone, including any poor people at his gate. He invited. So there we've got the rich man treating himself like a king, but actually being less generous than that pagan king in the Old Testament. But then we also see that we've done that one. That the poor man is covered with sores. Lazarus is covered with sores. Well, who's covered with sores in the Bible? There's only one man, and that's Job. And by the way, was Job rich or poor? He's rich. Was Abraham rich or poor? He's rich. Is there anything wrong with being rich? No, Job was rich. Abraham was rich. But Job could say, I've always looked after the poor. You see, the problem is not being rich, it's the way he was rich. And then it says that being in Hades in torment, the rich man lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. Now look at those phrases. And by the way, this is why I like literal Bible translations, because they're going to give you more of these connections between bits of the Bible. Where in the Bible do people lift up their eyes and see afar off? There are 2 places. One is in the book of Job. Oh, by the way, Job is the only other place where you get feasting every day. It seems to be Job's sons. There are 7 of them, 3 daughters, and they hold a feast 1 day per week, every, different son, and it's a sibling-only feast. They only invite their siblings, they have their sisters round, that's who it is. But of course, Job's friends come, and it says they lifted up their eyes and they saw him from afar. So Jesus is filling his story with references to the book of Job, where there's a lot of lessons to get, and there's a bit more. Because, of course, he calls out to Abraham, and he lifts up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off. The real time in the Bible you get this is Genesis 22 verse 4. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. That's the place he has to offer up his son. You've got 4 links: lift up, eyes, from afar, and Abraham. Jesus is filling his story with those sort of references. He's also the person in the Bible most often said to lift up his eyes and see. He calls out Father Abraham 3 times, calling Father 3 times, just as the younger son calls out Father 3 times in the previous chapter, Luke chapter 15. Now think about that. 3 times Father, Luke chapter 16, 3 times Father, Luke chapter 15, and in the middle, the non-father, where the older brother says, look, all these years. That's the way it's structured. Let's look at another story briefly, this parable of the Good Samaritan. Someone comes up to Jesus who's an expert in the law, and rather than taking this as his best ever opportunity in his life to learn something, because he's finally actually meeting someone who knows more than him, he's meeting Jesus, the most knowledgeable person ever, so it'd be a really good chance to learn. He decides instead of trying to learn, he's going to test. And this sometimes happens, you see it in Q&A sessions, I'm sure you won't see it later, where people, rather than actually trying to learn, actually try and show off what I know. So but he's doing this for the crowd, right? I'm sure you won't do it. So he's wanting to perform in front of everyone and say, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus doesn't give him an answer. He gives him a counter question. In the law, what's written? How do you read it? At this point, he gives a really good answer. Top of the class. He answers with a perfect answer. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbour. We know that's a perfect answer because Jesus gives that as a perfect answer on another occasion, okay? At which point, Jesus says, this do and you will live. Then we read that he wants to justify himself and said, yeah, but who is my neighbour? Well, that neighbour word, I need a bit of a dictionary definition on neighbour before we can really do that. So notice he doesn't want to say, I need a dictionary definition of God. That bit's going to be impossible, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. But he wants to pick on the easy bit. Let's see if we got some negotiating on who I can exclude as my neighbour. It's got different meanings. At which point Jesus says, let's go back. If you're a scribe and expert in the law, there's only one place in the Bible that someone ever says, this do and you will live. In that order, this do and you will live. Do you know who it is? It's Joseph talking to his brothers who last time they'd met, they'd left him naked, just like the man in the story that Jesus is about to tell. So, there we got it. Jesus tells of a man stripped naked and abandoned. Well, and then he gets to the end and asks the question about, who was a neighbour. And it's an amazing way because it's got the same structure, question, counter question, statement, command, being do, and that happens all again. Right, let's go on to another story. That was too brief for you. I know you missed some things. Get the slides. Parable of the strong man. Remember that Jesus says, who can go into someone's strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he binds a strong man? Then he may plunder his house. Well, look, where's that come from? It comes from the Old Testament. Isaiah, or you would say Isaiah, so I'll translate it for you. Can the prey of them be taken from the mighty, or the captives of the tyrant be rescued? And thus says the Lord, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken, the prey of the tyrant be rescued. Or Jesus tells this story, the story of the parable of the sower. Remember, the sower goes out and he sows the sort of parable of the non-strategic sower. Yeah, the one who actually wastes so much of the seed. Like, why so unstrategic? Well, actually, that's quite a method for us. Actually, I'm going to say this. Remember to be unstrategic sometimes. Everyone's trying to optimize everything as if you can. And God's built randomness into the universe. Genesis chapter 1, seed, seed, seed. And the thing about seed is you don't know what's going to germinate. So we're all trying to model stuff all the time. And actually, God has built that non-predictability into things. That's really important. Anyway, just a lesson I had to do. But Jesus' detail about the 100-fold harvest, well, that seems to come from Isaac back in Genesis 26. And isn't it wonderful to have that bit in Jeremiah 4 verse 3, do not sow among thorns. There are lots of biblical references there. When you've got the parable of the unforgiving servant who actually owes his king 10,000 talents. Is there a story before in the Bible of someone who owes his king 10,000 talents? Yes, that would be Haman, who's promised 10,000 talents, which is an absolutely huge amount, to King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, in exchange for being able to pick on other servants, and who ends up falling and begging for mercy of Esther, just like this man ends up and falls and begs for mercy. The parable of the talents begins, there was a man, a master of a house, who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press and built a tower. And that again comes from Isaiah, or you'd say Isaiah 5 verse 2. He dug it, cleared it of stones, planted it with choice vines, built a watchtower in the midst of it, and so on. So what I'm saying is not that every single one of Jesus' parables is filled with loads of references to the Old Testament. I think when he's engaging with these scribes in Luke chapter 15, he particularly piles it all in. But it's a common thing. It's a feature of the way he speaks. There's huge depth there. Now, just want to look towards the end about, was Jesus actually the genius? Or is it possible that the gospel writer was the genius, or someone else was the genius, and these brilliant stories don't actually go all the way back to Jesus? Okay? And I'm going to argue they go back to Jesus, every little bit of them. Okay. One of them is to recognize that when we're in Luke 15 and 16, which are amazing passages, there are loads of connections between the different stories. They all have to come from the same person. Could be Luke, could be Jesus, but it has to be the same person. So, I've mentioned already about the addresses to the Father, 3 times in chapter 15, 3 times in chapter 16. I've mentioned already about how you've got 2 stories next door about wasters. But have you noticed in chapter 15 that it says that the son, runaway son, was longing to be filled with the things that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. And it says of Lazarus, the poor man, in chapter 16, he longed to be filled with the things that fell from the table, but the dogs came and licked him. So they longed to be filled. That's a very particular phrase in both of them. And then you've got, in one story, pigs, and the other one, dogs. Now, this is over in Luke's Gospel and only in Luke's Gospel. But you remember that over in Matthew's Gospel, you've got pigs and dogs together. Don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't give what's precious to the dogs, or they'll trample into the foot or turn and rend you. So the same pairing of those 2 lots of unclean animals we find attributed to Jesus elsewhere. So saying Luke made this bit up won't make sense of how that other stuff got in Matthew's Gospel. Do you see? So the simple way is saying there's one mind, Jesus' mind, that has these 2 things, and they go out into different Gospels. The young man who's run away, the younger brother, says, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? Now, that same word, how many, exactly the same phrase, comes up in the next story when the unjust steward is saying, how much do you owe? They each do, at the same point, a self-address, a soliloquy. They talk to themselves. The younger brother does, so does the unjust steward. They saw afar off. The father, who's an Abraham figure, saw afar off in chapter 15. In chapter 16, you've got the formerly rich man in Hades seeing Abraham afar off. The father says, quickly do this. That's the word which actually the unjust steward says. Quickly sit down and change the bill. You have celebrate coming up again and again in Jesus' story of the 2 sons. What you see is the same word come up in the story of the formerly rich man and Lazarus, because it said he celebrated every day. But he's having this selfish celebration, him, but not the man at his gate. Then it says that the older brother in Jesus' story of the 2 sons called one of the servants, said, what's going on? Calling one, that exact same Greek phrase occurs in the story of the unjust manager who calls one of the debtors and says, how much do you owe? As for the rich, the older brother says, you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. The conclusion of Jesus' next story is, make friends for yourself. The father comes out to the older brother and says, child. Exactly the same word that Abraham says to the rich man in chapter 16. And, of course, chapter 16, verse 1, there was a rich man who had an unjust steward Chapter 16, verse 19, there was a rich man who's feasting every day. So I want to say all of that has to come from the same person. Luke 15 and 16, they come from the same person. Is it Luke or is it Jesus? Okay. Well, we know that the author has to be from the land of Jesus. Why? Because if you look at the story in the middle, the story of the unjust manager, when he asks the debtors in, he says, how much do you owe? And one of them says 100 baths of oil. Another one says 100 cores of wheat. Those are the liquid and dry measures for that land, for Palestine, not for other places. So that is clearly geolocating these stories, right? Then we see that Jesus concludes saying the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And then he talks about making friends from unrighteous mammon. Well, mammon is an Aramaic word that helps geolocate the story. And the sons of light is a phrase that comes up particularly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which come from that land, which geolocates that story. So everything there, and we know it's one person, we know what land they come from, and they seem to be a Jew, and it doesn't seem that's what Luke was. Also, the author knows rabbinic traditions. I've shown you how Jesus' story of the prodigal son hits on Genesis' greatest hits. It also picks up on rabbinic things. Now, rabbis often had stories of 99 and 1. Okay, so that's one bit. They also had a story of how there was a lost sheep and Moses found him. But look at this. This is a bit of a rabbinic story, so completely independent of Christians. This is a story about if you seek matters of Torah, I'm looking at the second line there, Torah, the law, like these hidden treasures, the Holy One, blessed be he, that's God, will not withhold your reward. This is analogous to a person, if he loses a cellar or a kilarin, those are coins, in his house, he will kindle several lamps, several wicks until he finds them. So in other words, rabbis from that particular land are talking about a man, notice, a man losing a coin in the house and searching for it. And what's it like? It's like when you've lost the law. Jesus picks up on that theme, addressing scribes who are experts in the law and says, guys, you're like a woman who's lost the law. But when you find it, there's a great celebration. So who is the author of these stories? Someone who's brilliant, someone who knows the Old Testament, someone who knows rabbinic traditions, and someone who knows Palestine. And fifthly, someone with Jesus' fingerprint. Let me explain. There are fingerprints in the way Jesus speaks, because across the different texts he speaks the same way. He often begins a parable with a question. Which of you will have a friend? Which father among you? Which of you by worrying can add a cubit to his height? And sometimes these are in Luke, sometimes they're in Matthew as well. And so when he says, which of you having a sheep, if he loses one, having 100 sheep and loses one, doesn't go? Which woman, if she loses a coin, doesn't search? It's exactly the same structure as Jesus is teaching elsewhere. This is a parable over in Matthew and only in Matthew. You know, there are two parables of two sons. There's the one in Luke 15, there's one in Matthew 21, and this is the whole thing. It's really short. It says, what do you think? A man had two sons. He went to the first and said, son, go and work in the vineyard today. And he answered, I will not. But afterwards he changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same. And he said, I go, sir. We're going to come back to that, sir. But he did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father? They said the first. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the tax collectors and prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but tax collectors and prostitutes believed him, and even when you saw it, you did not afterwards change your mind to believe him. So, addressing a similar audience, talking about tax collectors, not tax collectors and sinners, but tax collectors and prostitutes, he's saying there was one son that looked like he was going to do the right thing and didn't. There was another son who didn't look like he was going to do the right thing and then did. Well, that's the same basic story as Jesus told in Luke 15. It's the same structure, but it's in a different gospel, and it's clearly not that one comes from the other. They're different stories as well. But it also begins with a question. What do you think? Just as Jesus begins his stories with what do you think? Then you can also see Jesus has common endings to his stories. When he tells the story of the lost sheep, he says, I tell you, thus there will be joy in heaven. But that's what Jesus does over in Matthew's gospel. Gets to the end of the story. Thus it's not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these should perish. Or the father in the story of the two sons at the very end says it was necessary to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. Exactly the same thing happens when you get to the end of Jesus' story of the unforgiving servant over in Matthew 18. It was necessary. Was it not necessary? It's the same word, that you should have had mercy on your fellow servant, slave, as I had mercy on you. So, another feature of Jesus' teaching is to pair male and female examples together. So we get that in Luke 15, the story of the male shepherd losing a sheep, and then the story of the woman losing a coin. And then that's the build-up to Jesus' longer parable. Now, you get the same thing happening. Matthew chapter 12, Luke chapter 11. Jesus will illustrate first the men of Nineveh, then the queen of the south, the queen of Sheba. Or he will say the kingdom of God, this is Matthew 13, is like a grain of mustard that a man took and sowed in the field. Next thing, it's like a woman who took and hid the three measures, the leaven in 3 measures of flour. Or Jesus will say, 2 men will be in one field, one will be taken and another left. Or then there'll be 2 women grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. You see the structure. This is Jesus' fingerprint. The argument of Luke 15 is that humans are worth more than sheep. You begin with sheep, you go to coins, and then you go to the most valuable at the end, right? But over in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is making a whole argument from the fact that, well, isn't a human worth more than a sheep? So some of the same ideas are coming across in different gospels. This has all of the hallmarks of Jesus. We've already looked at this parable. The other parable of the 2 sons, the same sort of reversal. Now notice this, the way the 2 sons reply. Number 1 says, I will not, but then does it. Number 2 says, I go, sir. So there you've got Jesus' storytelling technique. The question of how should someone talk to their father? One has no sir and the other has a sir. Now those figures don't correlate with the figures over in Jesus' other story in Luke 15, because the one who says sir in this story here in front of us, Matthew 21, then does the wrong thing. And over in Jesus' story, it's the one who says father all the way through who does the right thing. But what it does, it shows the same storytelling technique, a concern about how should this character address their father? The same sort of thing we've got going throughout. So in other words, we have hallmarks of Jesus, another hallmark of Jesus. Now, parables are actually something that really are distinctive of Palestinian rabbis from the land of Jesus, not from other places. There are other ones. So that's already something that locates it. But other rabbis don't do parables back to back. But we're really familiar with parables back to back in the Gospels. And you've got 3 stories back to back in Luke 15, but they're different from the ones you got in Matthew 13, where you got 8 parables. So what you find is, even the very principle that we just stack up lots of parables, and that's why the disciples are saying, why are you teaching them in parables? You're not just using them occasionally, you're using them systematically. That is a hallmark of Jesus. So all of these things point to the fact that the genius is Jesus. The stories have a single brilliant author, and the longer stories have to be handed down with integrity, because you can't make brilliant stories by committee. Now, if Jesus' longest story comes from him and has been handed down with integrity, there's every reason to think that every single shorter story can be handed down. If you can have a 388-word story handed down with integrity, then all of the ones that are less than that are going to be a load easier. And Jesus repeats himself, so you can see how his disciples would memorize them. But there's this, and this is really astounding. It's almost as if Genesis has been written to get you ready for Jesus' longest story. It's almost as if it's giving you the building blocks of this story, because Jesus' story in Luke 15 of the two sons doesn't look like a hodgepodge. It doesn't look like it's got, bad loose ends and it's just fitting together and someone's artificially trying to shoehorn bits from this long book of Genesis into a story. It just reads smoothly. It engages you. Every single word counts. And so how can you have that happening from a book of Genesis? Well, what if the same person who designed Genesis and everything that would happen in it is the same one who told that little story? Suddenly it makes sense. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him. What we have with Jesus is the greatest genius that's ever walked the planet. Now, we've known that he's God, and therefore he knows everything. What I'm trying to share with you is that there's signs of the genius in the text. Things you can point people to say, it's really smart. And the smartest is also the simplest. Anyone can make things more complicated. Jesus doesn't do that. You know what he accuses the academics of his day doing? He says, you take away the keys of knowledge. He says that to the Pharisees. What they do is they lock away knowledge. That's often what we do. We start using more complicated language than we need to lock away knowledge. We don't want, just general people to know that. And Jesus is able to speak with an absolutely amazing knowledge of everything and make it simpler. He is the best teacher. And one thing I really hope, you just go away with a sense of wow and a praise of him for his awesomeness. And then to think, he's not just a teacher who said it all but didn't do it. He's the teacher who gave up his life for us. Knowing everything he knows about us, knowing all our sins, he did that. And that's just amazing that one so precious has done that for us so that we in all our weakness and our utter stupidity could come to him and there'd be celebration as we, the lost sinners, are found. Thank you very much for listening.